you guys. All right. So just like always, I am recording this Zoom meeting. And so once we're done here today, I'll post it in our Zoom class video section under the nervous system tab for September 22nd. And the notes for today are 9/22 Tuesday notes, the nervous system. But before we get into those, I wanted to share with you guys one important thing that we have coming up this week. And that would be our midterm exam. So now that we're about halfway through the school year, I kind of want to see what you guys know, what you guys have picked up on over the last 3 to 4 weeks. And so this midterm is going to go live tomorrow, so very beginning of the day on Wednesday. But like it says right here, it is not due until Friday. So you have until the end of the day on Friday to get this midterm finished. So the way that it's set up is similar to a lot of the worksheets that you guys have been doing so far, where you can do the Google Doc version or the Google Form version. So the reason why it's not due until Friday is because some of the stuff, including the stuff that we talk about today and on Thursday, is going to be part of the exam. So if you want to jump into it and start working on it right away, that's totally fine. But there might be some stuff on there that we don't cover until Thursday. So make sure to keep that in mind while you're going through it and before you submit it. So the exam is a little bit longer than a lot of the work that we've been doing in this class so far, which is one of the reasons why I'm giving you guys a couple extra days to work on it. And so it's set up sort of like a normal exam that you might see if we were still in class. There's going to be some multiple choice questions to answer. There's going to be some labeling style questions, kind of like what a bunch of your homework has been about. There might be some short answer questions where you have to write in a phrase or a sentence to describe the answer. And so there might be some like ordering, like for the respiratory system that we were going over last week. This question asks you to place kind of in order how air travels after it goes into the nose and before it gets to the blood. What are all the structures in order that it's going to pass through? And then some labeling stuff and some questions about the nervous system that we're talking about this week. So it's 31 questions, like I said, a little bit longer than the worksheets and stuff that we've been working on so far. But again, you do have from Wednesday until Friday in order to complete it. The Google Form version has all of the same questions, but is set up slightly differently. So this one I've partitioned out into sections in order to make it a little bit easier to kind of go through the different topics we've talked about so far. And so on this first section, it's just making sure you have your name written down. And then when you hit next, it doesn't submit that to me right away. It just takes you to the next set of questions. Again, exact same thing as the Google Form version, just laid out, or as the Google Doc version, excuse me, just laid out in this little bit different way in case this is the way that you like to do your work for this class. And so once you're done with one section, one set of questions, you just hit the next button and it'll take you to the next set until you make it all the way through all of the different sections of the exam. And then just like all of the other work that you've been doing so far, you'll hit the submit button and a copy of your answers will get sent to you and I'll get a notification saying this person finished up and submitted their midterm exam. Again, it's work that we've been going over from the past 3 to 4 weeks. So it's not just the nervous system stuff we're talking about this week. It'll also be stuff on the respiratory system, the digestive system, and the circulatory system. So because that's not due until Friday, I also still have a couple of daily assignments for you guys just to make sure that you're still able to get the attendance credit in case you're not able to make it to the Zoom meeting. But I've made sure to make these pretty short assignments. So hopefully neither of them, the Wednesday or the Thursday assignment, should take too long. Make sure that you do complete these because they are still due for a grade as well as your midterm exam. So make sure you get all this stuff completed sometime in the next week if you want to stay on top of your anatomy classwork so far. All right. Any questions about anything before we jump into the nervous system notes for today? Any questions about the exam or the work for this week? All righty. Remember, if you do ever have any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat and I'll try to answer them when we come to kind of a pausing point in the notes. Or if you think of them afterwards, you can always reach out to me on Google Classroom or through email or text. So with that being said, let's jump into the nervous system. All right, so today specifically, we're mainly going to focus on sort of the major players of the nervous system, the nerve cells and the major organs that are involved with this extremely complicated series of signals. So the nervous system is probably the most complex system of organs that we have in our body. So we're just going to be doing a super basic kind of overview run through of some of the major things to look at. So today we're focusing on the different cells and kind of how signals get passed from place to place. And then on Thursday, we're going to go more into detail about how your senses work and how your senses connect to your brain up top here. So nervous system is this connected network of cells and tissues and organs that are constantly sending signals back and forth to one another and that allow us to react to things in our environment and perform life activities like moving, eating, sleeping. All that stuff is regulated by your nervous system. So the picture on the screen that you're looking at, the sound of my voice that's coming through your speakers or your headphones, all of that is sensory information that's being picked up by the nervous system. And then that is controlling your muscles to determine how to react to that. So hopefully this isn't being too stressful or too scary, so it's not making you want to get up and run away. But maybe if something was coming and charging at you, then it would activate those muscles to help you get out of the way and be safe. So your nervous system basically controls what you sense with your 5 senses and how your body reacts to those senses. So you have your 5 senses of vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. All of those having receptors that are communicating with your nervous system. Hey, this is what I'm seeing. These are the sounds that I'm picking up in the air. This is what the texture of this thing I'm touching feels like. The nervous system also transmits information, right? So you might feel the table or the computer or your dog or your cat with the tips of your fingers, but your brain is not in your hand, right? We've got to get that sensory information from your fingers to your brain, and that's where the transmitting comes in. So not only does the nervous system allow you these senses, it also has the cells to send those senses to the brain. In your brain is where we then process that information. So your brain is what makes sense of those vibrations in the air that we call sound, or those light waves hitting your eyeballs that we call sight. And then finally, that produces some sort of response, whether or not hormones are going to be activated or your muscles need to be contracted or relaxed. All of that occurs due to the nervous system. So the functional unit, sort of like the main structure, the main workhorse of the nervous system, is the neuron, which is the fancy science name for the nerve cell. So neurons are the structures in our system that send the messages around the body. So you've got millions of them running through your fingers and arms, through your torso and down through your legs, and then especially clustering up around your brain. You've got millions and millions and millions of neurons constantly sending electrochemical information back and forth from each other. So neurons are like sort of like the power lines of your body, right? They've constantly got information flowing between them. And one neuron is super tiny, right? It's macroscopically small, which is why you need a continuous kind of line of neurons going from like your hands and feet back to your chest and then up into your spine and your brain. So there are a whole bunch of different important parts of the nerve cell, or the neuron, that we're going to talk about in more detail in a second. We've got our cell body right here. So most cells, the entire cell would mostly consist of the cell body, right? A lot of cells are kind of small and round or squarish. Neurons are a little bit different. Because they have to send those signals over long distances, they get super stretched out. So the cell body is where all of sort of like the normal cell structures are. And then branching off of one side of the cell body are these little guys called dendrites, which accept in information to the cell. And then the axon is sort of like the arm of the cell where it takes that information and passes it through to the axon terminal over here, which is where this signal goes from one neuron to another one. So this is just one neuron that's part of a chain. And if you can imagine there being another neuron right over here, the dendrites of neuron number 2 would be just about touching these axon terminals, and then it would carry that signal on even farther. And then surrounding the axon, this like yellow structures in here, this is a substance called myelin, which is sort of like insulation for the neuron. It helps the signal to move much faster through the cell than if the myelin wasn't there. It makes the neuron a lot more efficient at sending signals. Ooh, so now I was asking about, so in atoms, we have a nucleus, right? So Matt's in my IPC class where we've been talking a lot about atoms and protons and neutrons and electrons. So atoms have a nucleus of the protons and neutrons right in the middle of them, which is different than a neuron, which is a nerve cell. A neuron also has a nucleus right down here, but that is a cell nucleus. So nucleus is sort of just a fancy way for saying like center area of something. And so a cell nucleus is different than an atom nucleus. A cell nucleus is where all the DNA for the cell is stored. And then an atom nucleus is the area where the protons and neutrons are grouping up. And then a neuron is the whole nerve cell. All right, so very similar spellings and soundings for all of those, but they refer to different things.
Thanks.
No problem. So like I mentioned, the cell body of the neuron is sort of the main cellular component of the nerve cell. So this is where all of the little structures that help the cell to survive and get energy and get rid of wastes, they all exist in the cell body area. Those dendrites on the left-hand side of our picture, those were those little branching projections that take in information and bring it through the cell body. And then the axons are those big long arms, and those take away those signals, those impulses, and pass them along to the next neuron in the line. Or if it's a type of neuron called a motor neuron that we're going to be talking about in a little bit, they might pass it to some muscle cells. So again, we've got dendrites that take in the impulse or the signal. We've got the cell body where all of the major kind of cell functions of the neuron happen. We've got the axon with this big long arm stretching away that carries the signal. And then remember that axon is coated in the myelin that helps it to be a faster, more efficient sending of the signal. And then don't worry about the Schwann cell and the node of Ranvier. We're not going to get to that today. But it all ends in the axon terminal where the signal from one neuron gets passed to another one. So here's another kind of slightly more realistic-y drawing of a nerve cell where we've got the dendrites all over here branching off of the cell body. And then we've got this big long axon coated in myelin carrying the signal away. So it has little arrows here for the signals. And then over here you can see how the axon terminals of one nerve cell directly interact with the dendrites of the next nerve cell. And then that carries the signal through the cell body and down the axon down to the next one in the chain. So this is how we can send signals from our toes to our brain, even though nerve cells are super tiny and microscopic. Is we have these long chains of them where they just pass the signal along from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And obviously, they do this incredibly quickly, right? When you stub your toe against something, your brain is made aware of it almost instantaneously. And so in that tenths or hundredths of a second that it went from your toe getting stubbed to your brain getting the pain signal, that signal traveled through thousands and thousands of neurons to go from your toe to your brain, all in a split second. All right, any neuron structure questions so far? Any questions about these structures or what they're doing for this particular cell? All right, so that's how basic neurons are structured. And so next we're going to talk about some of the main types of neurons that are in our body. So the nice thing about these neurons is that their names pretty much tell you what they do. So you have sensory neurons, which are what detect stimuli, which are things in your environment. So like your fingers have a lot of sensory neurons in them. Your eyes have a lot of sensory neurons. Your inner ear has a ton of sensory neurons. So these are the neurons that pick up on signals your body is getting from the outside world. Interneurons are kind of the in-between neurons, where once the sensory neuron picks up that signal, it'll pass it to the interneuron, which will take that signal up to the brain. So obviously there are a lot of sensory neurons that are picking up signals, and then they carry that signal close to the spinal cord, and then the interneurons take that signal and move it up and down the spinal cord to go up to your brain and then back out again. And then finally, our motor neuron is when our brain decides to have a reaction, it'll send a signal to that motor neuron that controls a certain area of a muscle. So motor neurons are involved in motion, and they're the ones that attach to our muscles. So whenever you want to, say, start walking, for example, your brain has to send a signal through interneurons and then to motor neurons down to your legs to say, okay, left leg, pick up and move forward and go down, and now right leg, pick up and move forward and go down. Over and over and over again, those interneurons and motor neurons are interacting. And then whenever you're seeing something or listening to something, like what you're doing right now, your sensory neurons are taking in that information from the world, passing it to the interneurons, which then go to your spinal cord and to your brain. So here we have some examples of the different types of neurons. Over here we've got a motor neuron. You can see that its axon terminals are connecting right to this little muscle fiber right here. And so these guys are what control the activation and relaxation of your muscles. Again, we've got the dendrites on the outside, the cell body right in the middle, and then the big long axon with the myelin around it. Our sensory neuron over here is set up a little bit differently. It's still got the terminals and the cell body and the axon, but this time it's attached to a little receptor cell. So this maybe is a receptor in your skin that tells your skin if it's touching, I don't know, something hot versus something cold. So when you touch something and determine its temperature, that's because the receptor cell is picking up the temperature and sending that signal along through your sensory neuron. And then over here, we have our interneurons, those neurons that go between the sensory neurons, the brain, and the motor neurons. So they're literally like the in-between neuron. They're what connect our sensory and our motor neurons by the use of the brain. All right. So while your brain does control most of the actions of your motor neurons, sometimes we can get a signal through the system that does not rely on our brain to have any input. And these are things that we call reflexes, right? So when you step on something sharp like a nail, or you touch a really hot stove, your arm or your leg might jerk back before you could even think about what's happening. So we have these automatic reflexes where the brain doesn't even have to get involved. So this is pretty much a direct connection between our three different neurons that we've been talking about, which is why I like to bring it up in this section. So let's say you step on a nail. Not a good time here. So the sensory neurons in the foot pick up on the fact that, hey, something just damaged our cells and is inside our body. This is not good. We should get away from this. So they pass that information on. So here's like our little sensory neuron connected to the skin and of our foot. That goes into our spinal cord where it passes that information to our interneuron right here. So we trigger that interneuron, and then instead of sending that pain information up to your brain and then back down and out to your motor neuron. Instead, it skips that step and just goes directly through the spinal cord to your motor neuron. So it bypassed that brain step entirely and go immediately to activating a motor neuron. So when this motor neuron is stimulated, it'll send a signal to the muscles of your leg, which will pull your foot back from that painful nail that you just stepped on. Now your brain will get a pain signal a little bit later, and by a little bit, I mean like a couple hundredths of a second later. That signal will send up to your brain, and that's why you feel the pain of stepping on the nail. But as a way that our bodies have evolved to try and avoid dangerous contacts and dangerous situations, we have these reflexes where the sensory neuron gets triggered, which immediately passes through the inner neuron and triggers our motor neuron. So, I don't think, oh, yep. So the same thing happens when you go to the doctors and they take that weird little orange hammer and boop you right below your kneecap, and it causes your leg to like spasm and kick out. That's because they're activating some sensory receptors in your knee that cause that reflex arc to happen and contract your quadriceps muscle and straighten your leg out. So swing your leg out in front of you. So this is one way that doctors test. The reason that they do this reflex test is to make sure that your nervous system is working correctly. So if they hit this nerve and you don't have that reflex, it doesn't get sent through the spinal cord and through that inner neuron up here, that could be a signal to the doctor that something is wrong with your nervous system and it's not correctly sending those reflex arcs that it's supposed to be. Any questions so far about our different types of neurons or what they do? Alrighty. So again, sensory neuron takes in information from the outside world. Inner neuron connects the sensory neuron to the spine, and the brain. And then the motor neuron is what receives those signals and causes an effect to happen in your muscles. So we can group the nervous system into kind of two general groups. Either you're part of the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord, or you're part of the peripheral nervous system, which is basically all the other nerves in your body that are not involved in your brain and spinal cord. So all the nerves that run through your torso, your legs, and your arms, those are all part of the peripheral nervous system. One really cool part of the peripheral nervous system that we're going to talk about in a little bit is called the autonomic nervous system, which is basically the stuff that your nervous system controls that you don't even have to think about. Things like your heart beating, moving food through your digestive system, all that is part of the autonomic nervous system. And we'll get there by the end of class today. All right, so first up, we have the central nervous system. So this gets information in from the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, and then takes that information up to the brain where it gets interpreted, it makes sense of the info coming in, and then it sends signals back out to the peripheral nervous system to activate those motor neurons. So we've got two kind of major parts of the central nervous system. Our brain up top here inside of our skull, and the spinal cord running through the vertebra or backbone going along our back. So if the brain is the main control center, the spinal cord is like the major highway or interstate that takes in all that information from those sensory nerves and sends it in one straight highway directly to the brain. It then also is responsible for carrying those signals back out of the brain and sending them to where they need to go in your peripheral system. So we have our brain up top and our spinal cord running through our backbone. So like I've been saying, this takes in all of that sensory system and determines what do we need to do about this? Do we need to change anything about how our body is acting right now in order to respond to the stuff that's happening around us that we are sensing? It's also for things like humans is where memory gets stored. So we remember things with our brain in the central nervous system. And that's also where we do our thinking. So our ability to think about problems and come up with solutions, maybe based on past experiences and memory, all of this is stored and researched in our central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord. We're going to talk a whole bunch about the brain on Thursday when we go through our senses. So we'll talk about the different structures and parts of the brain and kind of the major role of each one of those. So if you're worried that you weren't getting enough brain talk today, do not worry. We're going to go way deep into the brain on Thursday. And one of the bummer things about taking the online classes this year is that usually when I'm teaching this in person, I'm able to order sheep's brains and have you guys take a look at them and see some of the different structures in a sheep's brain, which is really cool. Okay, so we were just talking about our central nervous system, our brain, and spinal cord. And again, tomorrow we're going to talk about Thursday, we're going to talk about all these different structures that are inside and around our brain. And so the other part of the nervous system that's not the CNS, central nervous system, is our PNS, peripheral nervous system. And just like how the central nervous system can kind of be divided between the brain and the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system can also be divided up, but not based on structures necessarily, but based on control. So there is the autonomic part of our peripheral nervous system, which is the kind of like the name suggests, the automatic stuff that we don't have any direct control over. Then the counterpoint to that is the somatic nervous system, which is the stuff that we do have control over. So me being able to talk and move my mouth to make sounds and use my hands to gesture, all of that is stuff I am controlling. My hands and my mouth and my tongue are all moving because my brain is telling my muscles to cause these movements to happen. That's the somatic nervous system. All right. So like I was saying earlier, if our brain and our spinal cord are the central nervous system, all the other nerves spread out through our body make up the peripheral nervous system. So basically anything that's not in the brain or the spine is peripheral. So a peripheral nervous system is responsible for using those sensory cells to pick up information about the world around us and send those signals to the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is also what receives the signals from our brain in the central nervous system and then sends those signals out to the motor neurons. And then those motor neurons, which are part of the peripheral system, are what stimulates our muscles. So effectors is just a fancy science term meaning the things that motor neurons are attached to, because it's not always a muscle. It could be like a gland, like a sweat gland or a hormone gland or something like that. But the motor neurons still stimulate them to cause some sort of reaction. So if our central nervous system is all about collecting information and processing information, our peripheral nervous system is all about sensing this information and then causing some sort of motor-based reaction to it. So the easiest part of the peripheral nervous system to think about, like I was mentioning earlier, is the somatic nervous system. And so this is what controls voluntary movements. So like I was saying, whenever I'm talking or whenever I move this mouse around here, or if I go exercise and jump up and down and ride on a bike, that is all being controlled by the somatic nervous system. So my brain is telling my muscles, and I'm conscious of me, I want my arms and legs to move this way in this specific function. So it's stuff that we control. It includes some things that it seems like we don't control, like the reflexes I was talking about earlier. Even though we don't maybe directly have any control about when a reflex happens, it's still part of the somatic nervous system because it still has to do with sensory neurons triggering those motor neurons to do some sort of action. But again, the main thing to remember with the somatic nervous system is that this is things that we control, what we have control over in our body. So if the somatic system is things that we have control over, the autonomic nervous system is things that we do not have control over. So it has to do with involuntary responses, with obviously involuntary meaning that not controlled, not under our direct control. So things like organs, glands, and smooth muscles. So smooth muscle is muscle that's around a lot of your stomach and your digestive system. So obviously we have control of the muscles in our jaws and mouth to open and close our teeth. But then once we swallow our food, we don't have to sit there and consciously focus on moving the food down our throat and into our stomach and into our intestines and through all 20 feet of our intestines, right? That would be too much for our brain to handle. Instead, that's part of the autonomic system. It happens automatically. The food, the muscles in this system in our stomach and our intestines will do that peristalsis. So remember, that was the fancy word for like those little wavy contractions of the muscles. That is not something that we directly control, right? You can't control how fast or how slow food goes through your digestive system. It's just going to happen and you're going to have to deal with it. Also, things like your heartbeat, right? Your heart has to beat every single second of every day if you want to stay alive for more than a few seconds. But it would be too taxing for our brain for you to always have to think about like, and beat, and beat, beat, and beat, and beat. No one wants to keep track of that all day, every day. That's too much. So we put it on autopilot, right? You don't have to think about our heart beating. It just does it. It just happens. Now, obviously, our heart can beat faster or it can beat slower, depending on the situation that we're in. But again, we don't have any direct control of making our heart do that. Now, we might have some indirect control. So maybe if we do a whole bunch of exercise, our autonomic nervous system will increase our heartbeat to make sure that the blood and oxygen flow correctly. Or if we do a lot of relaxation and yoga and stuff, maybe that'll decrease our heartbeat. Not because we focused and used our brain to slow down our heart, but because our brain responded to the information around it, and the autonomic system slowed down the heartbeat based on that information. Right, so anything that your body sort of does automatically that you don't have control over, that is your autonomic nervous system at work. So we can divide the autonomic nervous system into kind of two groups, two camps of responses. There is the parasympathetic response or system and the sympathetic system. And these two guys kind of work in opposite of one another. So I'll come back to this picture in a second. So our sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is also sometimes known as the fight or flight division. So this is the one that will get you amped up and ready to take on a potentially like dangerous or thrill-seeking situation or behavior. So whenever your body is getting ready to, like, it goes into defense mode and it's ready to defend itself or get away from a problem, then a whole host of things will start happening. Your pupils will dilate, they'll get bigger so that more light gets into your eyes so you can see things a little better. It'll up that heart rate so that the oxygen can be moved around and all of your muscle cells can have plenty of oxygen. You'll start breathing faster. Your digestion will slow down, right? Because your body's like, hey, we're about to get in a fight. This is not a time to be having fun and chewing and digesting food, right? We got to slow all that stuff down because stuff is going on. So that's the sympathetic division, the fight or flight, getting your body tense and ready to do something. On the flip side of that is the parasympathetic division, which is also known as like the rest and ruminate or the rest and relax response. So I always remember that by the parasympathetic has that R in it, and the R is for rest. So now if we're relaxed, if we're in a safe environment, our pupils might get a little bit smaller, right? We don't need to worry about seeing everything hyper clearly. Our heart rate will slow down a little bit. We'll start breathing more normally or a little bit slower. So this parasympathetic really kicks in whenever you're eating. So you're eating, you're having a big meal, so it's gonna start the digestive juices flowing, it's gonna start the saliva flowing in your mouth and stuff like that. So anything related to resting and relaxing is in the parasympathetic, again, R for rest. Whereas anything in that tense fight or flight state is the sympathetic division. So this picture kind of breaks each one down. Over here in our parasympathetic, we've got saliva flowing in our tongue. So if you like smell a bunch of tasty food and you're hungry, that's maybe when the parasympathetic is gonna kick in. So your saliva starts going, your heartbeat slows down because we're not doing a whole lot of activity because again, we're sitting down maybe to eat a big meal. The bronchi might constrict a little bit. We don't have a ton of airflow going in and out, so we don't need these tubes to be super big. We've got a whole bunch of secretion going on, so our digestive organs are getting ready to do some stuff. Our liver is releasing the bile so that we can break down those fats in our food. Whereas the sympathetic, the fight or flight response, we've got bigger pupils so we can take in more light. We don't need to worry about eating or drinking anything right now. So our saliva is going to decrease, our stomach and our liver are going to stop producing any of their gastric juices. Our heartbeat starts to beat faster and the bronchi in our lungs dilate and open up a little bit. so that we can get more air in there. We can kind of maximize our air intake. We're going to activate the adrenal glands that are around our kidneys. So adrenaline and noradrenaline are going to start being produced, which help to accelerate our heartbeat and really get our body moving. And then we don't need to worry about going to the bathroom right now. We've got important stuff going on. So we inhibit contraction of the bladder, right? If you're really tense and you're really scared, or like you're getting ready to maybe get into a fight, your body doesn't want to worry about getting rid of waste. So it's going to kind of slow down everything involved in eating and excretion. All right, so again, this is all part of that autonomic nervous system. So all this stuff happens without your direct control. It just automatically kicks in depending on the situation that your body finds itself in. So if we put everything together, it might look something like this. We'll start down here at the bottom with our sensory nerves. They take in information about the world around us and then send that to our spinal nerves, if they're in our hands and our feet, or the nerves in our eyes and ears around our head. Maybe we'll go just directly to the cranial nerves. Either way, that signal will end up in the brain, either going there directly or going through the spinal cord. So we go into our central nerve. We started in the peripheral nervous system down here. We end up going into the central nervous system. Our brain makes a whole lot of decisions about what it's seeing, what it's sensing, what's going on in the world around us. And then it sends information back out through the spinal cord or through those cranial nerves back into the peripheral nervous system, where some of those signals might activate our somatic nervous system. So it might be telling us to get up and move around. And some of those signals might activate our autonomic motor nerves, our involuntary system. So maybe we're doing a fight or flight response. Maybe we're doing a relaxing response. Either way, stuff is going to be happening in our body. Some of it we can directly control, like our movement, and some of it, like our heartbeat and our digestion, are just going to happen automatically. So that is sort of the basics of our nervous system in a nutshell. Made up of neurons, which have those dendrites and axons on them. We have the sensory neurons picking up information. The interneuron, so our sensory neurons are picking up information. Our interneurons are carrying that information to the spine and to the brain. And then our motor neurons are activating things like organs or glands, or they might be activating the muscles in our arms and legs and body to do some sort of action. All right. Hold on, what was that part? Oh, here it is. Any questions about different aspects of the nervous system? The neurons, the different autonomic or somatic systems, the central nervous system. Any questions about any of that stuff from the notes this evening? Alrighty. So, for the assignments that go along with the stuff that we've been talking about today, there are a couple basic ones that I have for you guys. So today's assignment, the Tuesday assignment, is a simple neuron labeling assignment where we have our basic nerve cell pictured down here. And I want you guys to tell me what do each one of these labels represent based on this little word box up here. So which one of these labels corresponds with the axon, the dendrites, the myelin, the muscle cells, the axon terminals? You'll list those out in the spaces below. So that is the Tuesday assignment. And then the Wednesday assignment, again, because our midterm is going to go live on Wednesday, but isn't due until Friday. Your Wednesday assignment is a super simple one where all you have to do is tell me which one of these functions matches with a motor neuron, which one matches with a sensory neuron, and which one matches with a interneuron. And that's it. That's all you have to do for the Wednesday assignment. But remember to make sure to do this Wednesday assignment so that you can get your attendance credit for Wednesday. And then when we come back on Thursday, we're going to talk in a lot more detail about how senses like hearing and vision work, as well as what are some of the major areas of the brain and what do they do in order to process these signals and control our body. Righty. So before we wrap it up for tonight, any final questions about anything related to the nervous system, the homework for today and tomorrow, or the midterm coming up on Wednesday and due on Friday?
Yeah, for the homework, is it all right if I turn it in tomorrow? Because I got work right after class.
Yeah, since you guys are in the Zoom right now, I already marked you down for your attendance for today. So if you don't get around to doing the Tuesday assignment until tomorrow, that is totally fine.